This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are
created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
This is Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson at WDET in Detroit. I'm in the studio with the show's producer, Carrie Jr. II. Hey, Carrie.
Good morning.
So, Carrie, yesterday you went to a ball game.
I did.
Here in the city of Detroit. Sat outside in the warm air.
Yeah.
Did you notice anything about that air?
No. I mean, I was too focused on the game to notice anything about that air. But I do have one anecdote of an experience when I went to the Ford Drive-In Theater in Dearborn once. And I think we were seeing like The Little Mermaid at the theater. And I don't know if it was at the beginning or the end or the entire time, and I just kind of habituated to the scent. But there was like a stench that was happening there, and we were like, that feels like the air that we're breathing can't be good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and right now, I feel like if you go outside in the morning sometimes as the sun is coming up and take a deep breath or look toward the east where the sun is rising, I mean, the sky even looks a little different, right? The sunsets and the sunrises here are a little more brilliant lately than they have been. And that's another sign of a change in the air around us. Of course, this is not new here in the city of Detroit or in Southeast Michigan. The idea that our air is not the cleanest is something that we have lived with for a long time. And there's now a report out, a recent report by the American Lung Association that quantifies how bad the air is. Detroit got an F for air quality from the American Lung Association. Anyone who's ever gone to school knows that's the worst grade you can get. It doesn't get much. It doesn't get any lower than an F. No. I don't even think there is an F minus. So that's what we want to talk about today: is why and how our air has changed here in Southeast Michigan, and what dangers that poses to us, the risks that are associated with air quality that is not the best.
Yeah, respiratory effects are the first thing I think of. Detroit has the second highest prevalence of asthma among major cities in the United States and is the fifth worst city to live in the U.S. if you have asthma. So there's already a whole population of folks who, one, either can get effects from this air or, living in this air on its own is probably going to be an impact on their ability to breathe there. I think when we were reading the article that we're going to talk about, the reporter Brian Allnut, who wrote this article, talked about how this is a result of the climate crisis. And some of the reports in the evaluations that we've seen evaluate the city's air quality over a period of time, but you can look back in 2023 and 2022. I pulled those up, and we got an F both those years, too. I look back at 2010 and F then. So I also wonder what locally are some of the reasons. So we're not wonder, but, we're an industrial city. We have a history of so much industry and factories that I'm sure probably plays into that as well. So getting into that will be really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main focus here when you talk about why our air quality is as bad as it is that industrial presence that we have in the city. The irony to me is that footprint, that industrial footprint, is actually smaller now than it has been at other times in our history. And of course, industry is regulated more closely now than it was in the past. So why aren't we making progress, right? Why aren't things better here in the city of Detroit? We'll talk with Brian Allnut, who's a reporter for Planet Detroit. He will be joined on the show by Nick Schroeck, who is an associate dean of experiential education at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. This is someone who is a real expert on environment and environmental issues here in Southeast Michigan. He has joined us here at WDET throughout the years to talk about these things. So it should be a really great conversation about what's happening with our air and why.
And why.
Okay, Brian Allnut, reporter at Planet Detroit. Great to have you here with us on Created Equal.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Also with us is Nick Schroeck, who is Associate Dean of Experiential Education at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. Nick, great to have you here as well.
Hi, Stephen. Great to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you and your story. The headline is Dirty Air. Wayne County gets an F in 2024 State of the Air report. What went into that grade from the American Lung Association?
So the Lung Association was looking at ozone and fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, which is measured both annually and daily. And Wayne County and Metro Detroit did really poor on the annual measure of PM 2.5, which, basically that's looking at the background pollution that you get on a daily basis. So that really points to having a high level of industrial pollution in the area. Although, Detroit's definitely getting hit by wildfire smoke too.
Yeah, the wildfires are, I think, something that everybody here can remember pretty vividly. The effect that they had, that was something we could actually kind of smell, and in some ways could see. How much did that have to do with this grade, given that in the past, before the wildfires, we also were not getting wonderful grades on air quality?
Well, it actually had nothing to do with the grades because this only covered 2020 to 2022.
Okay.
So this kind of gives us a good sense of what things were looking like going into that wildfire smoke year. But I think it's also worth pointing out that last year wasn't the first year we were affected by wildfire smoke. This has hit us before, but 2023, some studies are telling us that in the U.S., the Midwest was really the worst place for air quality. So Detroit was one of the top 5 cities in the country, along with places like Chicago and Minneapolis for fine particulate matter.
Yeah. Talk about why these things persist, I guess, here in Detroit and the Midwest. I mean, it is our industrial footprint, but as I said in the open, that footprint is smaller now than it has been in the past, and there's more regulation, at least on the books, of industry than there has been. What are some of the things that kind of confound us here?
Well, we're definitely dealing with high levels of pollution from vehicles and industrial sources. But the Lung Association and other people will point out that in general, air pollution had been improving since the Clean Air Act of 1970. And that's especially true with things like ozone. Michigan has been seeing, a lot fewer ozone days in recent years, as of other places like Ohio. But in the last few years, the level of, these fine particles have been increasing in the area. And the Lung Association points to climate change. So essentially, wildfires, driving more fine particulate matter, but then also heat driving ozone formation, because ozone happens when different chemicals combine in the atmosphere in the presence of heat and sunlight. So even though ozone has been going down, it could go up.
Yeah. Nick Schroeck, I want to bring you into the conversation here. You and I have talked many times about the air quality here in Southeast Michigan and the problems that we have with it. I want to start with you talking about the impact that this has on our health, on the people who live here and their lives. That this is not just about the air smelling bad or looking funny, but it is about what it does to us in our bodies.
Absolutely. Our exposure to things like fine particulates, that dust or that soot, those particles, as Brian mentioned, I mean, they're very small. They can lodge in our lungs, get into our circulatory system. So they can certainly lead to things like asthma, but they can also exacerbate underlying health issues and lead to significant events where people have very negative health outcomes. We're talking about cardiac issues or, people having difficulty breathing, which can also lead to cardiac issues. So, very real and measurable impacts on people's health from exposure to high levels of air pollutants. And I mean, one thing to point out about the trends over time is that we do know a lot more now about the health impacts from different types of air pollutants. Certainly back in the early days of the Clean Air Act, there was knowledge about the harm from certain pollutants. I mean, we know if there's too much carbon monoxide in the air that we're breathing, that can kill us, right? I mean, that's fairly common knowledge. Mm-hmm. That's why we don't, want to have a generator running in the house or something like that, right? That can be very harmful. But we've learned much more about health impacts at smaller levels of pollution over time and how that can negatively impact our health. And so what we're seeing is while we do have regulations, we do have some controls in place to limit air pollution, the health impacts are still present, and we continue to learn more about the consequences of exposure to these pollutants. So really, it's not just that we've got a bad grade. We have an F from the American Lung Association. We really need to be looking at improving our pollution control regulations and laws, installing new technologies to further clean the air. And then, another thing Brian hit on is the vehicle miles. I mean, what we're seeing is with cars, and again, these are cars and trucks that are still burning fossil fuels. That's really the main driver of air pollution in many instances. Of course, industrial sources are huge, which we'll talk about. But, we really need to look at shifting away from burning fossil fuels in our engines, in our cars and trucks, because that's what is kind of continuing to lead the growth in air pollution across the country. So in any case, massive health consequences from exposure to air pollution. Mm-hmm. We've learned so much more. The science is much more clear on the health impacts from this air pollution. And that's why we have to not just keep the status quo. We need to really increase. We need to reduce the amount of pollution, I should say, because we now know so much more about those negative health consequences.
Yeah. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and our guests are Brian Allnut, who's a reporter for Planet Detroit, and Nick Schroeck, who's an associate dean at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. We're talking about the air that we breathe here in Southeast Michigan. An American Lung Association report gives us an F for the quality of air in our city. There are a number of reasons for that. We're talking about those reasons, also talking about the impact that has on our health. In a little bit, we're going to talk more about what are the sources of the kind of pollution that we have here in Southeast Michigan and what we should be doing to be more vigilant about regulating those polluters. We want to hear from you, our listeners, as well during this conversation. Give us a call. Give us a sense of what you think the quality of air is here in Southeast Michigan. Do you walk outside in the mornings and notice strange smells or notice a strange color in the sky? The sunsets, the sunrises that we've had since the wildfires certainly have looked different. What goes through your mind when you notice these things? What goes through your mind in terms of your health? What things do you think we should be focusing on in order to make sure that the air is of better quality? 313-577-1019 is the number. That's 313-577-1019. And you can go to social. You can go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET. Brian, before we have to let you go, I know I want to talk just a little about a part of your story that compares the things that we do here in Southeast Michigan to another place that has an awful large industrial footprint, and that's New Jersey. And you talked in the story about a law that New Jersey passed to try to regulate industry more tightly. I think a lot about the comparisons between here and places like that. This is not the only place in America that has this kind of industrial presence. But in other places, I kind of feel like there's more vigilance about how that industry gets regulated.
New Jersey passed a pretty groundbreaking cumulative impact law, which activists in Michigan have also been asking for. So that's to address what some people refer to as sacrifice zones. So basically areas, which are often communities of color or low-income areas where industry is really concentrated. Mm-hmm. And what New Jersey did is that they passed this law that would restrict permitting for new facilities in overburdened areas, or limit expansions of facilities in overburdened areas. So that's the kind of thing that Captain Pruitt from the American Lung Association said could make a difference, as well as just lowering some of the national standards that we have. We're lowering the national standard for annual particulate matter, and that could definitely have a big impact. But the Lung Association is also pushing to lower the ozone standard.
Yeah. Okay, Brian Allnut of Planet Detroit, it was really great to have you here with us to talk about this reporting that you did and about the air quality. Thanks so much for joining us on Created Equal.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to keep Nick Schroeck, an associate dean at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School, talking about our air quality, why it's so bad, how we can make it better. Also, we'll get to you, the listeners, on the phones and on social. And again, 313-577-1019 is the number here. That's 313-577-1019. You can go to Twitter, #CreatedEqual, or at WDET. We'll be right back with more Created Equal.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, the host of Fresh Air. We bring you in-depth, long-form interviews with actors, directors, musicians, authors, journalists, and more. Listen to our Peabody Award-winning Fresh Air podcast from WHYY and NPR.
This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm glad you've joined us. Our guest is Nick Schroeck, an Associate Dean of Experiential Education at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School, an environmental expert. We're talking about the poor air quality that is ever present here in Southeast Michigan and has been noted recently by the American Lung Association, which gave us an F on its air quality report, the lowest grade you can get, obviously. We're talking about why that grade is so low, what the contributors are to the bad air that we breathe here in Southeast Michigan, and what we might do about it. How can we make the air cleaner? How can we prevent industry from polluting the air as much as it does here in Southeast Michigan in the first place? We'd love to hear from you as well, our listeners on the phones. Tell us what you make of the air quality around here. Do you live near an industrial site, a large one or a small one that you think fouls the air around you? What do you notice when you walk out the door of your house every morning? What does the sky look like? What does the air smell like? And what goes through your mind when you notice these things that make the air dirty? 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and #CreatedEqual, or at WDET, and we can include you in the show that way. Nick, so I want to start this part of the conversation talking about the contributors to this pollution, and I'm just going to start with an incomplete list of industry that we know is part of the problem. Of course, Stellantis has a very large auto plant on the east side of Detroit. General Motors also still has a very large auto plant in Detroit. They're really the last two of that kind of industry that we have. I can remember as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s in Detroit, we had many, many more. I think at one point we had like 13 auto plants in Detroit. But today, in their place, I guess, we have things like Marathon in Southwest Detroit, and they have a bigger footprint than they used to. They're doing different things than they used to. Of course, DTE, I think, has a presence down there as well. And the Ford Rouge plant, which has always been there, at least as long as we've been dependent on the auto industry. But if you think about just that list of polluters, I mean, it's a lot for one city. They are, in terms of scale, they're outsized, I think, in comparison to what you might find in other cities. But if you get past those huge footprint polluters, you also have lots of other things that we do or allowed to happen that that contribute. I'm thinking of salvage yards, for instance, in the city, and all kinds of small scale industrial sites. These are things that make it difficult and challenge us to figure out ways to prevent them from making the air dirty in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And with your list of the large major industries, yes, there's down on Zug Island, we have the EES Coke battery, which produces materials that go into steel making. We also have some large steel mills along the Rouge River, both on the Detroit and Dearborn side. Carmuse Lime, a large lime facility down there on the river. And so there's many major industrial sources of pollution. And to your point, Stephen, those large sources that, of course, we know about, and they're permitted and regulated as major sources of air pollution, that's where we can have a real impact through regulation, because there already are controls on those facilities, on the smokestacks themselves, right? So changes in regulations, changes in what we call our National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which is under the Clean Air Act, the law that governs the air around us of certain pollutants and making sure that we have relatively healthy air to breathe, right? And so changing those laws, things like particulate matter standards, ozone standards, that can have a real benefit in our air quality. But to your point about all of the other smaller or mid-sized facilities, many of them are also regulated by permits, but some sources are not. Even think about, I was thinking about this the other day when I was walking around my neighborhood, the number of leaf blowers that were being used after, people, after the lawns were cut. Major source of air pollution from gasoline-powered leaf blowers and the big lawnmowers and that type of stuff. And those are, largely uncontrolled, unregulated sources of air pollution that, we don't even really think about all the time. You might think about them when they're noisy, but you're not necessarily considering the air pollution impacts. And it gets really difficult to control things like ozone because there are so many sources and they're very diffuse sources. So things like fumes coming off certain types of paints, those contribute chemicals into the atmosphere that can turn into ozone with the addition of sunlight and heat. And so there are a lot of challenges with how we deal with many sources of air pollution. But what we can do is we can do a lot better with our regulations on those major industrial sources, as well as on things like tailpipe emissions on our cars and trucks, because again, that's where we see a major source of air pollution. So yeah, it's got to be a combination of approaches to get at all of these different sources. Because as you mentioned, there's, things like the auto repair shops, the scrap yards, the scrap yards is a big one in Detroit. We've talked about that, I know, in the past, but the amount of particulate matter and dust and things that come off of those scrap yards can be certainly very impactful for people close by. And then when you add it all together with the high number of those facilities we have in the city, it definitely does deteriorate our air quality.
Yeah. So if we are regulating these things, both large and small, I guess the question is, why isn't our grade getting any better? As Brian Allnut pointed out, we've had an F for a really long time. Is it that we don't have enough regulation, or is it that we don't use it effectively?
Well, I'd say it's a combination of both. I think we need stronger existing regulations, and then we need new ways of looking at things. You mentioned with Brian in the last segment, New Jersey's law focused on really addressing those hot spots, areas like we have in Southwest Detroit. Folks often cite 48217, that zip code where we have very high levels of industry. Dealing with those areas where you have already existing many sources of air pollution, looking at, should we be adding more facilities into that area, or should we be looking at reducing the amount of emissions over time? And that's where our laws do need to change, because typically when the state and federal agencies are permitting sources of air pollution, they're looking really on a facility by facility basis, seeing whether or not that facility would stay in compliance with the regulations and laws. And we're not looking at a kind of cumulative approach. And so you'll hear this term cumulative impacts. And really what that means is we're talking about all these different sources of air pollution that are feeding into the air around us. And, we're not necessarily thinking about the vehicle emissions or the gasoline powered leaf blowers when we're permitting the oil refinery, the Marathon oil refinery. So there's ways we can, I think, change our focus. And as the science has advanced and we've learned more about the health impacts from air pollution, we need to do a better job with regulation. And, why we're still getting an F, it's a challenge that we've had for a long time because of our many sources of industrial pollution, also the many miles of highway, and the fact that, we've got a lot of cars on the roads. We don't have, again, Stephen, you and I have talked many times, a transit system that's moving a high percentage of people around and keeping, cars off the road. So that's also a challenge that we have here in the region. The way that we're moving around ourselves, that is a major contributor to air pollution. And so until we get a handle on, reining in some of the pollution from industrial sources, dealing with that question of the cumulative impacts, that will require new laws, that will require new legislation to get at that issue. Until we do that, I think we'll continue to see struggles with the grades. And I should point out, we have an F, that's bad, okay? But you'll see some people will, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer, right? So full disclosure there. You will see some folks, quibble a bit with the methodology that takes place in these types of reports. But I think the overall message is very clear and accurate that we need to do better, and that people's health is at risk because of exposure to air pollution. And, we as a people and our government, we need to do a better job regulating that pollution, because, whether you want to say it should be a C or a D or an F or, whatever it is, it's not where it needs to be to make sure that we're protecting our health.
Yeah. So when we think, though, about the kind of changes that we could make to regulation, for instance, how much would people notice that in their day-to-day lives? So we have an F right now from the American Lung Association. Let's say we had a C because we were doing better at regulating industry. Would it make that much of a difference? And how would people know?
Yeah, well, so there's some things that are very apparent. So you mentioned, in the opening, where sometimes perhaps there's a malfunction at a facility and there's maybe an orange haze coming out of the smokestack instead of white smoke or more clear air emissions, and that's a visual thing. So when that problem gets fixed, or when the facility is operating the way that it should, you would see a different color of smoke, or you might not notice the smoke at all. Similarly with, of course, the wildfires, right? Like it was very apparent what that haze looked like, and you could feel it when you breathed in, right? And so my wife has asthma, and she will often say, I have to check the air quality because just, in the yard doing gardening, or if we're going on a walk or something, she'll notice that tightness in her lungs from poor air quality days. So if over time we do improve our air quality, it will be noticeable, both from a visual aspect of less haze. And the wildfire smoke, obviously, we can't control that from a smokestack, right? It's a much more diffuse source. But the things that we can control, over time, you would see improvements, both from the way that people feel when they're breathing in the air and also from the visual, ability to see clear skies and all of that. As far as health, we can also measure in terms of when people go to the hospital for acute asthma, asthma attacks, right? We can measure how many kids are being prescribed inhalers. You can track those sorts of metrics as well and see improvement over time. And that's where, because of a lot of the challenges we also face in the city with access to primary care doctors and making sure that folks have access to good health care, we also do have asthma is maybe caught later than it should be in a lot of kids in the city. And so that's another thing where we need to, you got to have a response to the health issue, but the main thing is really reining in that air pollution to try and reduce those health impacts in the first place. So yeah, you would notice it, Stephen. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, it might be a little bit hard, but I'll just give one quick vignette. Okay. So back before the Clean Air Act, back 1950s, 1960s, there were often days that were you had these thick smoke events from pollution where it was as if a fog bank had rolled in and you really couldn't see in front of you. And you can, folks can search pictures of, whether it's in London, they used to call it the big smoke because of all the air pollution there, but also here in Detroit and Gary, Indiana, you can see visually through photographs and videos how polluted the air was. Okay, so from that point, we've come a long way. It's just that we also now know a lot more about the science behind what contributes to negative health outcomes, and we need to do even better with our regulations. Yeah. But that's a good example of, there's stories and accounts of the snow being, brown, gray, black in certain areas by the stimulus because of all that soot and particulate pollution in the air. Thankfully, we don't have that happen anymore because of the Clean Air Act. And so, again, we just need to build on those gains. But there are things that people would notice. It might not be, fast, like flipping a coin. It'll take a little bit of time, but you would see some improvements. Yeah.
We got a call from John in Ferndale. He says, my son lives in Detroit and a nearby business is always fouling the air. He says, what can a resident do? I think that's a great question. If you're somebody who lives here in the city and lives near, a big business, a small business that is in some ways a polluter, what are your options? And how can individuals kind of leverage their voices to get to a better regulatory state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our state agency, the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department, Michigan Eagle, EGLE, they do have a 1-800 number. I apologize, I don't have it at hand, but it's a quick Google search away, and that is a environmental reporting number. So you can call and so in this instance, the son could call and say, I'm noticing some smells, some odors coming from this facility, or I'm noticing a lot of soot or smoke coming out of this facility, and the state should respond and investigate and see whether or not it is something that's a violation. And it is important to point out, too, there are sometimes things that might look bad, but it may be primarily steam or water vapor or something like that coming out of a facility. But it's always good to at least report it and then have the folks with the knowledge and expertise go out there and investigate and make sure that it isn't something wrong. Because this is a really key point, Stephen. Many times the way we learn about environmental disasters, chemical spills, oil spills, whatever, is from people seeing something and calling and reporting it, right?
Yeah.
Because
the green ooze along 696.
Exactly.
For instance, right?
Yeah, great example, right? People driving by, what is that, right? So they call in, and so sometimes people will call the non-emergency number for law enforcement. That's also something you can do. They'll likely then refer you to Michigan Eagle to report it. But that's a good thing. If you see something, definitely reach out, report it. And back in the day with when we had the incinerator still operating in the city of Detroit, residents would regularly call to report odor issues with that facility. And that led to a series of violation notices from the state and enforcement action from the state. And ultimately, that also led towards that facility being shut down because of citizen complaints and concerns. So it does matter. I mean, you might not notice a difference the very next day, but they should come out, investigate, and make sure that the facility is operating the way that it should, or they'll be dealt with.
Yeah. Of course, when you mentioned that Eagle has an 800 number, both the producers here and I went to the website to try to find it so that we could tell listeners. Our producer, Dave Lyons, found this number, 800-662-9278. I also found an environmental emergency number on Eagle's website, and that is 800-292-4706. We'll put both of those on the WDET website. Okay, we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking with Nick Schroeck of the University of Detroit Mercy Law School about air quality. Also continue to hear from you, the listeners, on the phones and on social. Call and tell us what you make of the air quality here. You live near a business that you feel like is a contributor to the pollution that fouls the air around us. What goes through your mind when you notice the things that are dirty about our air or our environment? 313-577-1019 is the number here. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and our guest today is Nick Schroeck, Associate Dean of Experiential Education at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. We're talking about the air quality here in Southeast Michigan. An American Lung Association report says we get an F for air quality, the lowest grade you could get. It is a grade we've gotten for some time, apparently, from the American Lung Association, and by many other measures. We have long known about the challenges we have here with our industrial footprint and some other factors that make it harder to keep the air here clean. We're talking about what those contributors are to the dirty air, what the regulation looks like for environmental polluters. And in a bit, we're going to talk about the disparate effects of this, which is a key factor in our decision to talk about this here on Created Equal. Nick, I do want to talk about the effects of this kind of air quality issue, and just kind of start with where these polluters are concentrated and who lives near those places. It's not a surprise, I suppose, that black and brown people tend to live in areas that are more polluted, and of course, people who are poor also tend to be more subject to these things. What do we do about those kinds of things? How do we change that dynamic so that if we're going to have bad air, at least all of us should suffer equally, I guess, is one way to look at it.
Right. Yeah, at least share in the burden. And this is something that the environmental justice movement, folks working to tackle these longstanding inequalities, continually raise it. And you have to point out and you have to acknowledge that these things don't just happen by accident, okay? And so, the expression, the wrong side of the tracks, right? So back in the day, people lived on, one side of the train tracks, one side of the other. A lot of that comes from, the other side of the tracks might have been the only place that black families were allowed to live, right? Or it might be the only place that people of certain ethnic backgrounds or religious backgrounds could live. And that's also where you might have had the town dump, or you might have had the a smelter or something, going back in the day, different types of industry. Yeah. And then when you go forward into, really the Jim Crow era before our civil rights laws, in the practice of redlining, and where, again, certain people were only permitted, black, brown folks, people of different religious backgrounds were only permitted to buy homes in certain areas. If you look at those redlining maps and you look at where we have neighborhoods today that are designated as environmental justice neighborhoods, meaning that you have a majority racial minority population, primarily low-income population. When you look at those maps, there's a pretty close correlation between redline neighborhoods and environmental justice neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So you have to acknowledge that, folks were really only able to live in areas, again, pre-1960s that were closer to industry primarily and already more heavily polluted back then. So you have to take that history into account and think about how we got there, okay? And then moving forward, what we have to do is look at where we're siting these facilities in the future, and then also how we're regulating present facilities to make sure that those inequalities of that disparate treatment doesn't continue. So you'll often hear environmental justice advocates talk about, okay, maybe it makes sense to locate this facility in this neighborhood because it's close to a rail line or it's close to the river, major port for moving goods and services, that type of thing. Maybe it makes sense to put it there for those reasons, but what about all the other existing sources and the historical harm that folks have experienced through no fault of their own? It was just the only place that they were legally allowed to buy a home, for instance. So, and then thinking about how do we also share in the benefits of that industrial activity? Right. And this gets to something like jobs, right? Like who gets a job at the oil refinery? Who gets a job at the steel mill? Making sure that if those facilities are located there, that the economic opportunities also flow into the communities that are impacted.
Yeah. Again, 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and #CreatedEqual or at WDET. Let's go to Aaron on the east side of Detroit. Aaron, what's on your mind?
Hi. Yeah, I was wanting to note, in addition to industry in the city, one major contributor to poor air quality would be trucking and semi-truck traffic. And, one major source of particulate matter comes from that diesel exhaust. And Detroit's one of the only major industrial cities that doesn't have a truck route ordinance that, contributes to poor air quality on a really hyper-local level.
Yeah. The truck traffic issue is huge, Aaron, and you're right. With the new bridge, the whole point is to make it easier for trucks to get across the river. I would imagine that we're going to see some increase in truck traffic. We're not great, Nick Schroeck, at making sure that traffic is, again, controlled, regulated in a way that minimizes its environmental impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with the Southwest Detroit Community Benefits Coalition, also folks on the East Side, Aaron, East Side Community Network, on this issue related to trucks. And yeah, we definitely need to do better as a city at regulating truck traffic, including enforcing restrictions on idling, because when those diesel engines, particularly the older ones, when they're sitting there idling, they're just, belching out that particulate matter. Mm-hmm. But then also looking at truck routes, they're Southwest Detroit, for instance, with the construction of the Gordie Howe Bridge. I mean, that is, talk about particulate matter. So that's just a massive construction site where, you've got so much dust coming off that site, as well as all of the mixing of concrete and things that contributes to more particulate matter. And then the trucks, constantly going back and forth, and many times through residential neighborhoods. And so absolutely, when the big truck comes through, rolls through the neighborhood, it's going to be emitting that particulate matter, and that has very significant negative health impacts. And so that's something that the city council definitely could address on their own, is having a truck ordinance that really does have some teeth and that really, works towards reducing this issue, which is very real. I mean, above and beyond the noise and the vibrations you get from those big trucks rolling down the street, there is that air quality impact that we really need to address. And the way that we do that is or that we should do that is by directly addressing what's happening and what's changing. And I feel like we're not quite doing that in Southwest. I hear from a lot of people who live in that area that they haven't been
included in much of a conversation about what changes, just what basically changes when you build a new crossing and welcome more truck traffic. No one's talking about what that does to the air quality in Southwest.
Yeah, and I mean, there may be some benefit for as far as idling trucks. I mean, one of the hope with the new international crossing is that with the more seamless connections to the highways on both the Detroit side and the Windsor side, that the traffic should move more easily and clear customs more easily, and so that you wouldn't have all those trucks lined up idling on Ford Street or whatever, right? Like they currently are to go over the Ambassador Bridge. So that could be one benefit. But you're absolutely right as far as the local consultation with folks about, and first of all, just hearing the stories about how many of these trucks are rolling down residential streets and really at all hours of the day and night. I mean, this is what I hear from folks. And shout out to Southwest Detroit residents who take the initiative. They've been doing things like counting these trucks. They've been, putting together maps that they're presenting to city council to really show they're doing that, really citizen science, doing the research, showing what these impacts are in their community. And that's, really laudable. And hopefully we'll get some movement because of their efforts.
Yeah. The argument about the new bridge and the new lanes making traffic better so that trucks aren't idling. It kind of reminds me, though, of the arguments we make about freeway expansion.
My gosh. Yeah.
696 was built when I was a teenager between 75 and the Lodge, and they said for years, this will make the traffic way better. And the first day it was open, it was just packed, and now it's like a parking lot all the time. So I guess I'm a little skeptical about the bridge.
No, Stephen, as you know, that's one of my like, I don't know what I want to call it, hobby horse or whatever. Like the induced demand, right? It's like
right.
The promise is we add a lane to the highway and traffic will flow freely. But you know what happens? People hear about that new road, they go there, they drive on it, and next thing, exactly, and then it's bumper to bumper traffic, and then we need more lanes, and next thing you know. With you're like Los Angeles with a 10-lane highway, which we don't want. I mean, so you're absolutely right. I'm also skeptical, of course, but that is one potential positive that you might have a little bit better movement of that truck traffic if things go according to plan. But I share your skepticism, Stephen.
Yeah. We've got a few minutes left. I wanna just give you a chance to talk about. Let's say we have a goal of getting to a C in 5 years on this report. Tick off 2 or 3 things that we could do that would at least move us in that direction.
Yeah, so a big one is more enforcement of our existing permitting requirements. So, I'd like to see increased penalties for facilities that violate their permit conditions. Often there's a lack of enforcement, the kind of prosecutorial discretion. Small violations are really let go, and I think we need to have more enforcement to try and use the laws that we currently have. Then I would like to see both at the local level things like a truck ordinance, things like additional planning on the part of the city to reduce impacts, but also at the state level. Looking at things like cumulative impacts, like we've talked about, all these many sources of air pollution, doing the studies that we need so we can identify, where the health outcomes are the worst and focus our attention there. And so that will take some money and some legislation at the state level. And then finally, I would say us as consumers, continuing to advocate for better transit options so we can, reduce the amount of cars and trucks on the road. That would be huge for us. Again, huge driver of our air quality problem is vehicle traffic. And so if we can, switch out those engines, make them cleaner, get to batteries, all that kind of stuff, but also trying when we can to carpool and to use transit, that definitely does have a positive impact. And so there's things we can do, today, right? We can get the $2 bus pass. We can do that. That is helpful. And then there's all those kind of regulatory changes and laws that we have to continue to push for as well.
Yeah. Good list, Nick. We got to get to work on it. All right, Nick Schroeck, Associate Dean at the University of Detroit Mercy Law School. Always great to talk to you about these things. Thanks for joining us on Created Equal.
Thank you, Stephen.
All right, I love ending a show with a work list. Let's get to work on these things. These things that Nick was just talking about, right? Yeah, action list.
Yeah,
right?
no, I think that's great. The moment or the
it's not just about conversation; it's about action
and solutions, the opportunities.
Right.
What I did think about was a conversation I had with my father. This is years ago, so I don't know that he still believes the same thing. But you were talking about lane expansion and freeways. Mm-hmm. He was like talking about, oh man, the East Side could use a new freeway, like east of 75. And I was like, Dad, no.
That's always our instinct, right?
We know the impact of that on our climate, on our air pollution, but also just the neighborhoods that live there. So it's like boo, boo, tomato, tomato on that idea.
And on traffic, right?
Traffic.
It doesn't make it traffic better. It just invites more cars.
Exactly. But good conversation with Nick Schroeck.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, that's going to do it for us on Created Equal. You can listen to recent episodes at WDET.org, and we would love if you would subscribe to our podcast. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lines. Our engineer is Nate Bender. The audio editing is by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bobian. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.